Hi, Professor Dyer here, talking about research in human development and family science. So one of the easiest ways to measure things, or most obvious ways, would just be to ask your subjects about it, right? Yeah, this is an interview, and we do use a lot of interviews in HDFS. So our question for today, what are the interview strategies that scientists use in HDFS? The first of those is the focus group. A focus group is a collective interview. It's interviewing several people together, usually 6 or 8 or 10 people together. We don't do this in order to find out individual, unique things about each subject's life. We do it when they have shared something in common, and they might be able to brainstorm and get ideas from each other and kind of collectively appraise those ideas. One example is this study published by one of my colleagues at Fresno State who held focus groups with parents who have school-age kids and who experienced a year of shutdowns, school shutdowns and kind of lockdowns in California as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. And she wanted to know, what do you think happened to family meal times and the way your family approaches food as a result of a year of COVID-19 shutdowns? And she found these 4 things. Most of the families had the impression that they and their kids were eating more, that they were snacking more. The nature of snacking had really changed. They perceived that all of the family members, adults and children alike, were gaining weight, and that they had family meal times together far more often. So they saw some kind of good things and some kind of troubling things that had come out of the COVID-19 lockdown. Another type of interview is the narrative interview, sometimes called an unstructured interview. Unstructured because the topic is identified, but no specific questions are asked. The subject is allowed to guide the direction of the interview. These are done one-on-one, and they generally include lots of individualized follow-ups, but the interview subject gets to drive the direction of the interview. An example of this from HDFS is a study that compared the perspective of immigrant parents with the perspective of preschool teachers. And in each case, the narrative interviews went something like this. The scientist said, "Tell me about having your child in American preschool." And to the preschool teachers, they'd say, "Tell me about having immigrant kids in the preschool that you work." And they let each interview subject sort of drive which direction it went in. They made a pretty big discovery. They discovered that teachers believe that it's appropriate to use play-based curricula and emphasize cultural continuity. They think it's really important that if a child speaks Hmong at home, they have a Hmong-speaking teacher in the classroom, so there's some continuity. That the foods that are eaten at home are also provided in the classroom, and that kind of cultural continuity is very important from a teacher's point of view. However, from a parent's point of view, the parents weren't that interested in those kinds of things. They wanted their children to learn English and to learn how to be prepared to sit in an American classroom. They said, we can teach them Spanish, we can teach them Hmong, we can teach them about our food, we can teach them all those things at home. We don't need you to do those things. We need you to make sure our child can speak adequate English and is prepared, knows what an American classroom is going to be like. So the narrative interviews allowed the scientists to discover a mismatch here, where what people want and what is being offered are not the same thing. And we need to figure out how to handle that. A third form of interview is the semi-structured interview, and this is one that's used more than anything else in HDFS. This is semi-structured in the sense that the same questions are asked of every subject, It's not entirely structured because there still can be follow-ups, and those interview questions, people are allowed to answer however they want. So one person might answer in 3 words, and another person might go on for pages and pages on the typed transcript. They're allowed to answer how they want, but the same questions are asked of everyone. That's what makes it semi-structured. This increased structure helps to improve the reliability of the instrument, and it allows the instrument to be far more precise. An example of this is the adult attachment interview. As you might know already, in very young children, scientists use an observational measure called the strange situation to measure attachment. And in slightly older children, they use a self-report task called the story completion task. But in adults, we can really get information about attachment using a structured interview. The interview, these are only a few of the questions on it, but they ask questions like this: describe your relationship with your parents, think of 5 adjectives that reflect your relationship with your mother, what's the first time you remember being separated from your parents, etc., etc. And every subject is asked the same questions. They're allowed to answer in whatever format and whatever length they choose, and the interviewer can ask follow-up questions. The responses to these questions are coded for their coherence, their thoughtfulness, the amount of rambling that happens, whether the subject avoids answering the question or whether the subject embraces it, whether the subject seems to be preoccupied and worried about these things, or if they can answer without evidence of worry. Those are how the interview is coded. What they found in the study that I'm describing right now, they did a strange situation measuring attachment in infancy, and then they followed up with the adult attachment interview 20 years later, and they found that there is a lot of continuity, that about 72% of the time the infant attachment classification is the same as what the adult attachment classification was given, and 28% of the time there was a change in attachment status. So what causes attachment to change? Fascinating question, and now we can explore it because we have a tool such as the adult attachment interview. So interviews, in sum, they're appropriate for questions about subjective reality. Interviews work well because humans are social creatures, and so the one-on-one or even the group. So in sum, interviews are appropriate for questions about subjective reality. Sometimes it's the only way you can get information from a person about what their subjective perspective on the world is. Interviews specifically work well because humans are social creatures. So the dynamic of a live interaction produces lots of information. People feel compelled to respond to a live human who's asking them questions, and that conversation tends to go back and forth, and it tends to be sort of vibrant and productive. And so we can get a lot of depth and nuance out of interviews, even as compared to other forms of self-report. Interview gives us so much depth of information. All self-report has certain limitations. Recall bias, meaning we don't remember things perfectly accurately, and social desirability, meaning we may want to give a version of events that paints ourselves in the best possible light. That's always true with self-report. Specific to interviews, there is another limitation, though, and that is interviewer bias. Interviews are live interactions between actual human beings, and sometimes we hit it off with a person, and sometimes somebody rubs us the wrong way. That is interviewer bias, that there are differences in the quality of the data based on something subjective about the relationship between that particular interviewer and that particular subject.